At 8:14 on the morning of May 23, 1914, Captain Edward Odlum stood on the deck of the SS Komagata as it dropped anchor in Burrard Inlet, 3 kilometers offshore from Vancouver's immigration dock. 57 years old, 31 years in harbor operations. He was watching 376 passengers, British subjects from Punjab, India, arrive at a port that would refuse to let them land, creating a constitutional crisis that would define Vancouver's role as Canada's Pacific gateway. The ship carried people who held the same British citizenship as any Canadian. They had purchased legitimate tickets. They were following immigration procedures. But British Columbia's government had passed regulations specifically designed to prevent their entry. Continuous journey rules that required immigrants to arrive on direct voyages from their country of origin, knowing no shipping line offered direct service from India to Canada. Odlum understood harbor operations, cargo manifests, and customs procedures. He didn't understand the politics that were about to turn Vancouver's harbor into the site of a 2-month standoff between passengers who refused to leave and authorities who refused to let them land. The Komagata Maru would sit at anchor for 63 days. Food would run low. Negotiations would fail. The Royal Canadian Navy would position HMCS Rainbow, an aging cruiser purchased from Britain, to prevent any landing attempt. On July 23, 1914, immigration officials would force the ship to depart, sending 376 British subjects back to India, where 19 would die in a confrontation with colonial police. Captain Odlum watched the ship's anchor chain drop into Burrard Inlet. The water was 18 meters deep, good holding ground. The ship wasn't going anywhere until someone resolved the crisis. Vancouver's harbor would become Canada's busiest port. But it would never escape the legacy of that morning. Vancouver's port exists because of geography. Burrard Inlet provides a deep, ice-free natural harbor on Canada's Pacific coast, the western terminus of transcontinental rail networks that carried freight from the Atlantic to Asian markets. The Canadian Pacific Railway reached Vancouver in 1886, and making the city's harbor the Pacific anchor of Canada's first coast-to-coast transportation system. But early development was chaotic. Private wharves, lumber mills, and fish canneries competed for waterfront space. Ships anchored wherever captains found depth and offloaded cargo onto small docks built by individual companies. There was no central coordination, no harbor master with authority over the entire inlet, no plan for expansion. The federal government created the Vancouver Harbor Commission in 1913, a crown corporation with authority to regulate shipping, construct terminals, and develop the port systematically. The commission's first chairman was appointed with a mandate to transform Vancouver from a regional port serving British Columbia into Canada's Pacific gateway, serving the entire country. And that chairman was Robert Piers Spaulding, a 48-year-old civil engineer who had built railways across Western Canada. Spaulding understood that Vancouver's value depended on connecting ships to trains, building terminals where cargo could transfer directly from vessels to rail cars without intermediate handling. His first project was Ballantine Pier, a 274-meter cargo wharf with adjacent warehouse space and direct railway connections to both Canadian Pacific and Canadian national networks. Construction began in 1921. The pier opened in 1923, handling lumber, grain, and general cargo. Spaulding also understood that Vancouver's future depended on bulk commodities. The prairies produced wheat, Saskatchewan produced potash, British Columbia produced coal. Asian markets needed all three. But bulk shipping required specialized terminals with conveyor systems, storage facilities, and deep-water berths capable of handling vessels carrying 30,000 tons or more. If you want to see how Vancouver transformed from a regional timber port into Canada's largest gateway for bulk commodities and container traffic, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this. And please subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Vancouver. The grain terminal at Burrard Inlet solved a fundamental problem: how to move prairie wheat 3,000 kilometers west by rail and load it onto ships bound for Asia without the delays and costs of manual handling. Chief Terminal Engineer James Boyce, 44 years old, and a veteran of Great Lakes grain operations, designed a system where rail cars dumped grain directly into receiving pits, connected to conveyor belts that lifted grain 50 meters to storage silos. Then gravity-fed grain through loading spouts into ship holds at rates exceeding 1,000 tons per hour. The Alberta Wheat Pool Terminal opened in 1926, with capacity for 77,000 tons of grain storage. Saskatchewan Pool followed in 1927. United Grain Growers opened a third terminal in 1928. Combined capacity, 234,000 tons. Combined loading rate, 3,400 tons per hour, enough to fill a mid-size bulk carrier in 8 hours. But grain was seasonal. Prairie farmers harvested in August and September. Ships arrived in October and November to haul wheat to Asian markets. The rest of the year, the terminals sat partially empty. Coal provided year-round traffic. British Columbia mines produced metallurgical coal, high-grade coal used in steel production, that Japanese and Korean mills consumed continuously. West Shore terminals opened in 1970 on Roberts Bank, 35 kilometers south of Vancouver, with capacity to store 200,000 tons of coal and load vessels at 8,000 tons per hour. The coal terminal required infrastructure that didn't exist. Roberts Bank was tidal mudflats. No solid ground, no depth for ships. Engineers built a 4-kilometer causeway across the mudflats to a man-made island constructed from 43 million tons of rockfill. The island supported a terminal building, conveyor systems, and a deep-water berth dredged to 18-meter depth. Chief Project Manager Donald Mackenzie, 53 years old, specialist in marine construction, supervised the causeway construction. Our workers dumped rock from rail cars running on temporary tracks built across the tidal flat. The fill settled into the mud, gradually building a stable roadbed. It took 3 years and 6.2 million tons of rock to complete the causeway. Mackenzie died in 1989 at age 72. The Roberts Bank Causeway carries unit trains, 110-car coal trains weighing 15,000 tons, across the mudflats every day. Container shipping arrived in 1969, when Vanterm opened as Canada's first dedicated container terminal. The terminal could handle vessels carrying 1,000 20-foot equivalent units, the standard measurement for container capacity. Cranes offloaded containers from ships and stacked them in organized rows for loading onto rail cars or trucks. Modern container terminals at Vancouver handle vessels carrying 14,000 TEUs, ships 366 meters long requiring 16-meter draft, and specialized cranes that lift containers from holds 20 meters below deck. Deltaport opened in 1997 with 65-hectare container yard. Fairview Terminal expanded to 36 hectares in 2008. Combined capacity, 3.5 million TEUs annually. Today, the Port of Vancouver handles approximately 145 million metric tons of cargo across 28 major terminals. That includes 100 million tons of bulk commodities, coal, grain, potash, sulfur, and 3.2 million TEUs in containers. Over 3,000 vessels call annually. The port generates 115,600 jobs across British Columbia and contributes $9.7 billion to Canadian GDP. The port serves as the western terminus of both Canadian National and Canadian Pacific transcontinental rail networks. Grain from Saskatchewan travels 2,800 kilometers west by rail to Vancouver terminals. Coal from northeastern British Columbia travels 1,200 kilometers. Potash from Saskatchewan travels 2,600 kilometers. All of it converges at Vancouver for loading onto vessels bound for Asia. And the entire system depends on Vancouver's terminals operating normally. A prolonged port closure, whether from labor disruption, severe earthquake-damaging terminals and rail infrastructure, or coordinated cyber attacks on port operation systems, would immediately strand bulk commodity exports with no alternate route. Canada's three main Pacific ports are Vancouver, Prince Rupert, and Fraser Surrey. Combined capacity exceeds that of any alternate routing through Atlantic ports or American gateways. Grain elevators across the prairies would fill within 3 weeks, on forcing farmers to halt harvest or store grain in temporary facilities. Coal mines in British Columbia would stockpile product until storage areas overflowed, forcing production cuts. Potash mines in Saskatchewan would face the same constraint, nowhere to ship product except through Vancouver. Container supply chains would collapse within days. Retail goods arriving from Asia supply Western Canadian stores, everything from electronics to clothing to automotive parts. Manufacturing operations depend on components arriving in containers. A 2-week port closure would empty retail shelves and idle assembly plants. The economic impact would exceed $500 million per day, a figure that accounts for lost exports, disrupted supply chains, and idle capacity across industries dependent on Vancouver's terminals functioning. The 2023 labor dispute that closed Vancouver terminals for 13 days demonstrated this vulnerability. Grain shipments stopped. Coal shipments stopped. Container vessels diverted to American ports or waited at anchor. The Canadian Federation of Independent Business estimated the closure cost $1.3 billion in lost economic activity. Unlike highway systems with alternate routes or electrical grids with redundant generation, Vancouver's port has limited alternatives. Prince Rupert handles 32 million tons annually, helpful but insufficient to absorb Vancouver's 145 million ton throughput. Shipping grain through Thunder Bay and the St. Lawrence Seaway adds 2,000 kilometers and multiple cargo transfers. The system operates at capacity, trusting that terminals function, rail networks deliver cargo, and vessels arrive on schedule. Robert Piers Spaulding served as Vancouver Harbour Commission chairman until 1939. He retired after 18 years of developing the infrastructure that transformed Vancouver into Canada's largest port. He died in 1952 at age 87. James Boyce continued designing grain terminals across Western Canada until his retirement in 1947. He died in 1963, age 81. The gravity-fed grain loading systems he engineered at Vancouver remain the fundamental design used today. Donald Mackenzie never saw Roberts Bank reach its current capacity of 35 million tons annually. But the causeway he built carries coal trains that supply 15% of the steel mills in Japan and South Korea. The Port of Vancouver operates continuously. Marine traffic controllers coordinate vessel movements through Burrard Inlet. Terminal operators manage cargo transfers. Bixo rail dispatchers sequence unit trains delivering grain, coal, and potash. Crane operators load containers at rates exceeding 35 moves per hour. And somewhere on the prairies, a grain elevator is loading hopper cars for the 2,800-kilometer journey west to Vancouver, trusting that terminals will be operating when the train arrives 72 hours later. The system continues. Canada depends on it continuing. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about infrastructure that connects nations to global markets. Real people. Real engineering. Real economic stakes. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. EOS, are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if you've worked in shipping, ports, or logistics. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Robert Spaulding, James Boyce, and the engineers who built Vancouver's port don't disappear into silence.